You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. I'm sitting here with Bruce Hoffman of the Council on Foreign Relations, but if you've ever come across the subject of terrorism at all in your career, you've read his work. Thanks for joining us, Bruce.
Sure, of course.
And I want to say to our listeners, we had a bit of an equipment failure, so I'm recording on my phone, so the audio quality is not going to be as good on this one, and I apologize. So, Bruce, pretty shocking assault by Hamas on Israel, on Israeli territory. Let's start with, how could something like this have possibly succeeded? I know that there's probably going to be all sorts of inquiries and investigations later on, and now is not really the time, but you have to wonder how such a technologically and militarily sophisticated country like Israel, that is designed to prevent things like this from happening, how an assault could make it over the border from Gaza.
I have to say that I'm immediately reminded of one of the most memorable lines from the 9/11 Commission report about the September 11th, 2001 attacks in the United States. And that was his criticism of the United States intelligence community. It said it was a failure of imagination. And I think that's exactly right. For Hamas, it was the perfect storm and the ideal opportunity. Firstly, I think Israel had become, as the United States and many other Western nations are, completely reliant on technological and highly sophisticated electronics platforms for gathering intelligence, in addition to just the difficulty of getting human intelligence. But that also, I think, led to perhaps a misplaced technological reliance on the technology of very sophisticated and innovative defenses, such as the Iron Dome. That Israel believed that it had a missile shield in place that in the past had always been successful in thwarting missile attacks. But the problem was it was oriented in some respects towards yesterday's war. I mean, Iron Dome can be very effective at tens or dozens or even scores of missiles being fired at it. But when you get the situation like on Saturday when thousands of missiles were fired, there's probably no anti-ballistic
Was it really thousands?
That's what the report says. But don't forget, it's not just long-range missiles. It's, man-portable, highly inaccurate, basement-made or bicycle shop-made Katyusha or Katyusha-like missiles. So one has to say, like, rockets, mortars, and more sophisticated missiles. Obviously, the more sophisticated ones are the ones that are landing on Jerusalem and Tel Aviv because they have the distance. But apparently, part of Hamas's plan, as in any military operation, was to confuse the defenders, get them to take cover through a barrage of indirect fire. And going back to almost all the conflicts, at least in this century, between Israel and Hamas or Hezbollah, what the United States military especially experienced in Iraq from many of the groups that also are backed by Iran, was this challenge of indirect fire from comparatively very inexpensive, in some instances even homemade, but also very sophisticated state ordnance that rains down indirect fire, whether it's for harassing cover or, in this case, is a combination of all of them.
I trust you saw that propaganda video that Hamas released after the attack where they showcased their suicide drones. Did you see that?
Yes.
And the first thing I thought of was, where could they have filmed that? Because it couldn't have been, you would think, couldn't have been in Gaza. I mean, there's wide open desert there where they filmed this. Possibly in the West Bank, maybe. But without being spotted, it seems like it's hard to believe, which makes you think that even that propaganda video was filmed somewhere else. I mean, just a thought.
Yeah, no, it's quite likely. And of course, too, it may well have been these suicide drones, and we don't know, necessarily what kind of ordnance landed and, what its launching platform was, which makes this more confusing. So I think the first thing was a lack of imagination, that in the past, Hamas had lobbed missiles, but it certainly wasn't a threat of this magnitude. Secondly, now we see a misplaced confidence in Iron Dome would be sufficient for whatever challenge was presented. I think thirdly, you have a situation where in recent months, certainly, and even recent weeks, the Israel Defense Forces, Israeli military intelligence, and probably civilian agencies have been riveted on the unrest in the West Bank and the complications there where there's no real organizations, but it's rather tanzim. It's just, brigades or gangs of militants that aren't following any command and control orders or aren't part of any organized structure, but have certainly been ramping up their violence in response, in part to something that also, I think, preoccupied Israel was the unrest at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which, of course, is Islam's third holiest shrine, and on the Temple Mount, which is also sacred to the Jewish people and has led to increased tensions. And then one has to say just the disarray of internal Israeli politics. When you have a country that is so inward focused for so long now, because of the daily rolling protests around the country, because of the current unpopular coalition governments.
And for those of you who haven't been following this, just for listeners, Netanyahu and his coalition partners have been trying to push through these pretty stark judicial reforms that some think would turn Israel from a democracy into something less than that. And there's been major street protests, including by reservists who've refused to turn up for military duty, and et cetera, et cetera.
Great explanation. That's exactly the point. So not only do you have this distraction or preoccupation with internal political divisiveness, polarization, vituperation, but you had an unprecedented phenomenon in Israel where reservists were not showing up for duty, which had to have some effect too. This is a lesson for the United States as well. And just as Israel's enemies were watching what was going on internally, politically in Israel and sensing opportunity, we can be certain that both our state adversaries and our non-state adversaries are very seriously and ardently looking at what's going on in the United States, especially a Congress without a speaker and our own divisiveness. But that's an aside. And then finally, you have, I really think, an evolution of Hamas into the kind of terrorist organization that really no one could have foreseen. Now, throughout recent history, at least, there have been other terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda, Tamil Tigers, for instance, more or less uniquely that have had the capability to operate from the air or sea and on land as well. But none of those groups were ever able to put it together in a coordinated, simultaneous assaults from all three dimensions. And that really is something that is profoundly alarming. And basically, we have terrorist groups that, as many people have been warning and as we've been sensing, are now acquiring the kind of assault capabilities that we once thought only resided in established nation states, militaries, or even uniquely terrorist organizations, but we still had this overconfidence they couldn't put all three together.
It really brought me back to a debate I know that you know well because you took part in it about when the 2006 summer war, after Hezbollah was so successful against the IDF, this discussion about are terrorist groups, are these really more hybrid groups that are non-state actors that wield the capability of states in some ways? And it really brought me back to that debate.
Well, also to think about the 2006 war, I mean, Hezbollah fired estimates of maybe as much as 4,000 rockets. But basically, they were firing in the 36 or so day war. That's roughly about, 100 rockets a day, a bit more than that. I mean, if it's true that the intensity of the barrage that Hamas launched on Saturday, that's also a warning point for the future. I mean, can any country, cope with thousands of rockets being of all kinds, again, not necessarily sophisticated, but just indirect fire and ordnance raining down on the population? It's very concerning.
And on top of this, and we won't walk through all the details, the many, if not most of them, extremely gruesome and troubling about the operation. But from a military perspective, not only the volume of the rockets and missiles, but the way that the attack was able to dismantle Israeli intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance and command and control. They took a base. They seem to have left the forces charged with monitoring that border in complete disarray very quickly.
Yes, I think that's what many Israelis, at least that I'm hearing from, find so shocking. I mean, intelligence is never perfect. It can never be omniscient. It can sense movement, but it may never have the accuracy to pinpoint at this day and time there's going to be an attack. But what's so troubling is that 2 military bases were overran, that the border defenses in an obviously very hostile territory to Israel seem to have been inadequate to being so quickly overrun. Or again, going back to this lack of imagination, that Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad would bring bulldozers and just knock down the barriers separating them from Israel and storm across the border.
Let's talk about the political timing of this. You mentioned the turmoil in Israeli politics, turmoil in the West Bank, where I believe most of Israel's active operational battalions were deployed on the eve of this attack. You also have these talks about normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. How important do you think that political context was for the timing of this attack?
Absolutely crucial. Of that, there's no doubt that the potential breakthrough, really the historical development of diplomatic relations between being established between Israel and Saudi Arabia is something that would have been a game changer in the Middle East, as indeed with the critical
to the detriment of the Palestinian national cause, or at least the armed Palestinian national cause.
The armed Palestinian national cause, and I think even more so to Iran, because it was designed to isolate and weaken Iran and Iranian influence. But part and parcel of that, I think that what was really alarming was the Saudi-U.S. Defense Pact, which would have been another immense game changer in the Middle East. So the timing, not least just the melancholy coincidence of Israel's previous greatest intelligence failure, the intelligence failure that led to the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which broke out on October 7th, 1973. And what we've just discussed, I mean, it really was the perfect storm. But, let me put into context. October 7th, 1973 was the greatest loss of Israeli life, at least since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And that was almost entirely combatants, Israeli soldiers, 317. We're already approaching 1,000, and mostly Israeli civilians, but also soldiers too being killed. Many people are arguing that it's going to eventually catch up with what happened to America on 9/11, 2001. So we're talking about an order of magnitude greater. In fact, in the entirety of Israel's history, apart from the Yom Kippur War, I think the only other parallel was the massacre at Kfar Etzion in May 1948 during the War of Independence, or the First Arab-Israeli War, where 157 soldiers and civilians were killed. So from an Israeli and a Jewish point of view, you really have to go back to the Holocaust to think of a day when more Jews were killed.
And especially in the context of a country whose national narrative, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way at all, but I mean this in an empathetic way, is really rooted in trauma in many ways. The aftermath of the Holocaust is a starting point. This will have a huge impact on how Israel sees its position in the region and the world going forward in ways that I think we still haven't been able to wrap our heads around yet.
At least from my understanding, proportionally, the Israelis who perished on October 7th of this year, it would be proportional. About 20,000 Americans died in a single day in a terrorist attack.
Let's unpack the international dimensions of this more. First of all, we've talked about Saudi Arabia and Iran a little bit. We don't have to go back too far in history to when Hamas and Saudi Arabia were actually quite close in many ways. Hamas was funded in part by Saudi Arabia, I think as late as the early 2000s. After 9/11 still. What changed, and how has Hamas swung much more towards not being a full proxy of Iran maybe in the same way that Hezbollah is definitely, but so much closer to Iran than Saudi Arabia? What changed?
Well, I think really the destabilization of the Middle East that we saw with the U.S. invasion of Iraq really eliminated sort of the counterbalance, at least in that part of the world, for Iran. I mean, Iran no longer had to care about another invasion from Iraq, such as the war that broke out in the 1980s and lasted for 8 years. With Iraq out of the picture, Iran became more aggressive, much like it was in the 1980s, in exporting its particular brand of revolutionary theocracy based on Shia.
And we should say, just Saddam also would support Hamas.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. In fact, Saddam's support of Hamas and of the suicide bombers, providing a stipend of initially $10,000 and then $25,000 to the families of suicide bombers during the Second Intifada, was in fact one of the justifications used in the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. But with Iraq eliminated as a threat to Iran patently has become just much more expansionist and much more aggressive. And you can go back to the early days of the revolution when the Ayatollah Khomeini came into power. He proclaimed this was precisely the mission of Iran, to spread this revolutionary fervor. And I think over the years, this became more and more concerning to especially the Gulf countries, who were at the sharp end of subversion, of clandestine activities, often militant ones and resulting in violence, became very concerned and began to look, especially at a time when the United States was withdrawing from the Middle East, for other security guarantees. So it became very attractive to enter into various diplomatic and other arrangements with Israel and to benefit from Israel's technology and also from Israel's strong presence in the region. And predictably, that did open up the door to a tightening of relations with the United States and of drawing the U.S. more closely or tightly back into the region, because the U.S. was the ultimate guarantor for Israel and for the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia in terms of the security threats coming from Iran.
Yeah, and I think you're right that Saudi Arabia became less interested and felt more threatened by non-state groups and movements. And you also saw that turn in Saudi Arabia and the UAE against the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas Precisely. Is the Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood, or was founded as such anyway, and which seemed to be an important aspect as well. But it's just interesting. It shows that we tend to say, well, they're Shia and they're Sunni, but that doesn't explain as much as we think it does sometimes.
No, the cliches never apply to the Middle East.
Yeah.
We can repeat them, but there's a different reality on the ground.
And so Hamas, a Sunni group rooted in the Muslim Brotherhood, now backed by Iran. Iran also, of course, helped found Hezbollah, is very close to Hezbollah. How would you compare and contrast the relationships between Iran and Hezbollah on one hand and Iran and Hamas on the other? Well,
they were all independent entities, and even though Hezbollah, as you know, was really birthed by, or Iran was clearly the midwife in its creation in the early and mid-1980s. It's still independent, operates independently, but its interests and its intentions align very closely with Iran. And of course, all three of those groups, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, or PIJ, were completely dependent on Iran for financial resources and support, for the provision of intelligence, provision of weaponry, and training as well. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards are very active in this respect. So they all have independent agendas, but they all align very closely. And as you just pointed out, it should go against the tropes of the Middle East that Shia and Sunni or blood enemies will never cooperate. But these are decades-long relationships. Certainly, Hamas's relationship with Iran was caused by Hezbollah, was facilitated by Hezbollah in 1992. In what was thought to be a brilliant stroke of counterterrorism, Israel deported 415 Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad activists and basically dumped them on a hillside in Lebanon in the middle of the winter. This became a huge international humanitarian issue. Hezbollah and Iran saw a tremendous opportunity, stepped in, provided training, instruction, forged these very close relations, which have now lasted for over 3 decades. And then when Israel was eventually compelled to allow these 400 plus individuals back into Gaza, well, of course, their enmity towards Israel was hardly moderated by this experience. And in fact, their confidence in being able to sustain and prosecute this struggle, if anything, was strengthened by this very close alliance with Hezbollah, which we have to remember right after 9/11, then Deputy Secretary of State Michael Armitage had said is the A-team of terrorism, which is absolutely true and still absolutely true. So Hamas and PIJ benefited enormously. We saw how their adoption of suicide tactics, which Hezbollah had pioneered in the early 1980s, was highly instrumental in the outcome of the 1996 Israeli prime ministerial elections that brought Benjamin Netanyahu to power the first time. And then I think had a really lasting impact on Israeli-Palestinian relations with the second intifada in the early 2000s. I mean, that was when really all attempts to arrive at some negotiated political settlement based on a two-state solution between Palestinians and Israelis began to unravel. Firstly, in 2000, the summer of 2000 at Camp David under President Carter, and then subsequently in the middle of the decade after the second intifada under Prime Minister Olmert, who once again tried to negotiate a settlement and came close, but in the end it fell apart. And I think that made everyone realize that really the lethality and the shock of the waves of suicide attacks, these were not systematic waves, they just unfolded. You'd have 7 in a week, which back then was unheard of. They just were sustained over a number of years. These, I should say, the more sporadic attacks, but it was unrelenting over time. Hardened both peoples and both governments, hardened their ability to negotiate. And I think other states in the region saw opportunity, perhaps, to work towards peace with Israel that would eventually leave the Palestinians isolated and compel them to join. But we can see that's massively backfired, that the Palestinians are not going along with that plan, as Saturday's events very clearly demonstrate.
Yeah, and we're picking apart just bits of such a complicated and long history here. But you mentioned Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another armed group. And I think just to remind our listeners, you're right to bring that up because it's false to call this just a Hamas attack. Hamas was in the lead, it seems, but maybe as much as a dozen or more different armed Palestinian groups active in Gaza of various sizes. Maybe that's an overstatement, but there's quite a few.
Well, Hamas is the ruling authority.
Yes.
Although let's point out, Hamas is hardly a model of democracy and good governance. There haven't been elections in Gaza since 2007 when Hamas came to power. It always has an uneasy alliance with Palestine Islamic Jihad. It's a much smaller group, but at least their ideologies, their religious fervor, their intention to impose Sharia over all Palestinian territory is at one. Hamas often doesn't tolerate other groups. I mean, they're certainly at loggerheads, and at times these loggerheads have erupted in bloodshed with the Palestine Authority that rules the West Bank, which just underscores your complexity that you're talking about. Two Palestinian populations, quite sizable, that are not contiguous geographically and also are ruled by different entities, and different entities who really mistrust one another.
What comes next? Israel is in the process of doing what very few countries in the world can do, which is mobilize, I think, 300,000 people
right.
in just a couple days. Very few countries in the world can do that. How are they going to use these troops?
Hi, everybody. Aaron Stein here. Just wanted to take a quick break for Brian's conversation with Bruce to play this clip from our latest Warcast, which I recorded with Michael Koplow this morning.
That leads to the last and, I think, biggest failure here, which is that Hamas fighters rampaged around southern Israel, murdering people in the streets and taking people back into Gaza. And it was hours before there was any real coordinated official response. And part of that certainly has to do with IDF preparedness. There are all sorts of reports now about reservists who are being called up and have no equipment because the supply warehouses are empty. There are GoFundMes going around for reservists to buy them helmets and bulletproof vests. We're talking about basic equipment. And it also has to be mentioned that 70% of active duty IDF soldiers before Saturday were stationed in the West Bank, including soldiers from the Gaza division, including soldiers from the base in the Gaza envelope that was overrun by Hamas fighters. So, all sorts of issues around preparedness and policy decisions about where you are stationing the IDF. And if you have 70% of the IDF in the West Bank, then obviously you are leaving both the border with Gaza and the border with Lebanon and Syria, which may be the next front, woefully unprotected.
If you're interested in hearing more from this podcast and some future members-only content that we're having about the latest from Israel, what may be in store in the conflict and the broader regional implications, please head on over to warintherocks.com/membership and sign up for a membership today to gain access to War on the Rocks Platinum. And with that, back to Ryan's conversation with Bruce.
I have to caveat this and say everything at this moment is speculation, because what's happened is really unprecedented. And when something's unprecedented, it's very hard to predict, but much less, assess what really will happen.
And we're recording this on Monday morning for those of you who are listening to this.
So I think you don't mobilize 300,000 reservists to stand around the border. I believe Israel's going in on the ground. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said as much. He has pledged to destroy Hamas root and branch. I think that after the events of this past weekend, that is a pledge that he will seek to make good on, if only because his own political viability has pretty much been called into question. I mean, he was the prime minister when this happened. He's been elected multiple times on platforms promising, guaranteeing Israeli security.
That's his thing. That's his issue.
Yeah, well, this is in the past now. But it's also why I think, especially given some of the ministers in his cabinet and their particular unrestrained and what some might, I think, actually describe as extremist views, especially towards Palestinians and Arabs, I think that there will be a ground invasion that will seek to destroy Hamas.
He's had an offer for a national unity government from the mainstream opposition parties. Do you think, we're guessing here, but do you think he'll take that? It would allow him to marginalize some of those more extreme voices in his government if he's even interested in that.
One would hope so. And certainly I think the situation in Israel calls for a national unity government as has been formed. It's similar, I would argue, perhaps even less serious crises in the past. But Whether he will do so, again, it's impossible to say. And there certainly hasn't been much public indication. Perhaps there are behind-the-scenes negotiations. You also have a government that is completely consumed. Before we can even talk about a ground incursion into Gaza, they have to clean up the Hamas, PIJ, and as you described, other militants who are operating independently that have infiltrated. It's not just the guys wearing, black tactical gear with vests and combat webbing that Israel's hunting. It's plenty of people just in leather jackets who also stormed across and have their own agendas. So they've got to secure Israel before they can then turn to Gaza. But I think when you mobilize 300,000 reservists, it's going to be a ground war. And I think that, the calls now for negotiation or for talks with Hamas, I hope that's the case, because anything that avoids bloodshed, and especially the civilians that are always caught in the middle of these types of conflicts, is desirable. But I just see an all-out attempt to destroy Hamas, which is going to be quite complicated, take a long time, and be quite lethal. The danger then, and we've seen this movie before, I have to say. In 2006, a conflict or clashes between Hamas and Israel, kidnapping of a corporal from an Israeli base when Hamas, once again, failure of the imagination, dug a tunnel and popped up in the middle of an Israeli military base and seized this corporal. And that led to exchanges of rockets and so on. And then Hezbollah opened a second front war. It would be much more serious now. Back in 2006, let's say, I think they're credible estimates, and again, we're talking about all kinds of rocketry and all kinds of indirect fire weapons, but Hamas had about 4,000 or 5,000 missiles, rockets of all kinds. I've seen estimates now that says that's 14,000 to 15,000.
Yeah, the magazine depth in Hezbollah arsenals is terrifying.
Exactly. So this would be an entirely different set of challenges. Basically, the entirety of Israel would be vulnerable to missile strikes.
Yeah, so that seems like the biggest risk for Israel is that this escalates, where Hezbollah joins. Unrest in the West Bank becomes even worse. You commented on this on Twitter. And does Israel have the capacity to handle something like that?
It would certainly strain the capacity of the Israeli military, which then I think opens up the prospect that does Israel decide to strike at least the patron of all of these groups in Iran in hopes of bringing Iranian pressure on Hamas, PIJ, Hezbollah, the Tanzim in the West Bank, to stop fighting. And, then we enter a completely different world.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of reports. The Wall Street Journal report came out with, unnamed but seemingly high-level sourcing in this militant community that Iran gave the go-ahead for this operation. A lot of experts on Iran and the IRGC have pushed back, including in Israel, saying this just doesn't seem plausible, that Hamas has much more autonomy on these matters and probably doesn't need a go-ahead from Iran. But on the other hand, could they have planned this without Iran? I don't know. The question about whether to strike Iran or not must be one of the biggest debates going on in the Israeli government right now.
Not least since Israel in the past has warned that it would strike Iran if it felt threatened. I mean, they were talking more in a nuclear context because of Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions. But Israel has warned that. But I think you've hit the nail on the head, and I think there's a huge difference between complicity and giving a green light or ordering it, and being the provider of financial resources. Absolutely no doubt that Iran bankrolls Hamas and PIJ. Provider of weapons, almost certainly. Provider of training and assistance, no doubt, because historically that's been the case. But that's still very different from saying that Iran was the mastermind behind this and Hamas was following its orders. I would say the same thing with Hezbollah. As I said earlier, they're independent entities, but their interests closely align with Iran's, which again makes this so complicated and so muddy, but also so dangerous that states can easily be drawn into this conflict, and then they become far more difficult to control or contain.
One of the most heartrending aspects of this has been the taking of hostages, in the dozens probably, Israeli civilians and soldiers. And among the civilians are women and children, and there's been some heartbreaking videos released by Hamas that I'm sure you've seen, that I won't go into the details there, but this does complicate a ground incursion, because you're risking basically writing off these lives, these people who are still alive, who are being kept hostage by Hamas, which of course is the exact dilemma that Hamas hopes to impose on Israel.
Exactly right. I think it's even more complicated and desperate than that. Gaza is riven with tunnels, underground bunkers, densely populated areas where it's very easy to hide people. So it's not going to be easy to find them. I mean, Hamas controls a territory that's roughly the size of Washington, D.C., and they have hundreds of hostages, including, by the way, reports of many Americans and other dual nationals or other nationals of other countries. Doubtlessly, all of those locations are going to be booby-trapped. It may even be the case that the hostages themselves are booby-trapped. So we're talking about a challenge of enormous complexity and risk. But, we've already seen how hostages seized in the Middle East can be held for years, in fact, and suffer unbelievable depravity and terrible conditions. I mean, I have to admit, having followed ISIS or the Islamic State very closely, and most especially the depredations that they inflicted on the 4 Americans and 2 Britons that they held captive, as well as the Japanese and Russians and the other European nationals. Some of those videos, which I've seen, and some of those reports, which are hardly credible, really harken back to the kind of base mistreatment that ISIS inflicted on the Yazidi people and the Chaldeans, and also on the hostages that they held. I mean, reports and credible ones of rapes and people being stripped and paraded through the streets, the elderly and infirm being dragged from their homes, the men separated and executed on the spot. I mean, these are things that conjure up images, firstly, of the Holocaust, but also more recently of what unfolded in Iraq when ISIS came to power. And of course, there were immense complications when the United States attempted to identify the locations of this handful of American hostages who suffered, unbelievably in captivity. One has to assume, certainly we have the video evidence that the hostages seized by Hamas are not being treated well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for joining us, Bruce. Appreciate this, and look forward to reading the article that you have coming out with us, I believe, tomorrow.
Absolutely. Well, you're very welcome.